The co-founder of Apple, Steve Jobs, has died. News of his passing spread globally on the devices he'd created. The iPhone, the iPad, the Mac. He left behind a fortune of more than $8 billion. But can the true legacy of Steve Jobs ever be quantified? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. As tributes to Apple's co-founder Steve Jobs flooded in, US President Barack Obama described him as one of the greatest American innovators. The man who gave the world the iPhone, the iPod and the iPad passed away on Wednesday at the age of 56 after suffering from pancreatic cancer. Apple's new CEO, Tim Cook, said the company had lost a visionary and creative genius, and the world has lost an amazing human being. Tom Ackerman takes a look at Jobs' legacy.
Our collective efforts have changed the world of personal computing forever.
Steve Jobs, just a few months after his company unveiled the Macintosh personal computer.
The Macintosh is small and friendly, almost cute for a computer, and people who see it get excited.
It was the first machine to merge a computer's memory components with a color screen monitor. And it offered another innovation, a graphical interface. The Mac had been preceded by the Apple II, the first computer which allowed the user to navigate through tasks by pointing and clicking onto icons, a feature that rival Microsoft later copied. Jobs' ambition to shatter the dominance of computer pioneer IBM was dramatized in this commercial, regarded as one of the most effective ever made.
Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
The son of a Syrian father and American mother, Jobs was adopted and never finished university. He began designing and building the first Apple model with his childhood friend Steve Wozniak, making them both millionaires by their mid-20s.
The power to learn.
But the Macintosh failed to bring Apple consistent profits, and in 1985, Jobs was forced to resign from the company. Years later, he credited that setback with his eventual success.
I'm pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it. Sometimes life's going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith.
And 12 years later, Jobs was back as the head of Apple.
Plug in.
More powerful, successful machines like the iMac desktop followed. Jobs' next triumph, the MP3 iPod portable music and video player. Its companion iTunes online store soon became the top-selling legal website for downloading music.
Just one smile?
Then came iPhone, the world's most successful smartphone. It's reaped billions in profit, not only for Apple, but thousands of software developers who built custom applications to suit every interest. Soon thereafter, the iPad, a wireless tablet computer that once again set the industry pace. Jobs extended his pursuits to computer animation. That investment led to the creation of Pixar, a studio whose feature films like Toy Story and Finding Nemo won critical acclaim as well as financial reward.
Good work.
Amid his professional achievements, Jobs battled recurrent bouts with cancer, ultimately requiring a liver transplant, which was kept secret to avoid repercussions to Apple's stock prospects. But for Jobs, that ideal proved to be just another challenge for the better.
Death is the destination we all share. It's life's change agent.
When his illness finally forced Jobs to give up the helm at Apple, the Wall Street Journal described him as one of the 2 or 3 leading historical figures of the tech revolution. To all those who admired his passion for innovation, Jobs left this message.
Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Tom Ackerman, Al Jazeera.
Well, joining us now to discuss the legacy of Steve Jobs are our guests. In Cairo, Abdullah Schleifer, Professor of Journalism at the American University in Cairo. In London, Duncan Bell. He's an editor of the gadget magazine T3. And in Paris, American broadcaster and former Wall Street broker Max Kaiser. Now, it was interesting that reference in the advert we saw there of the competitor as a big brother using Orwellian symbols. 25 years ago, Steve Jobs was portraying Apple as cutting edge, breaking with the past, and most importantly, liberating. Well, Duncan Bell in London, to begin, was this purely a marketing ploy or a genuine belief in the product?
Oh, it was a genuine belief in the product. I mean, also it was a brilliant way of expressing that as a marketing ploy. And that was sort of Jobs' genius, was the mixture of his conviction that he put into everything that he did. The fact that he was right more often than most people are correct, but also his ability to present both objects and ideas in ways that people could understand very simply.
Well, Abdullah Schleifer in Cairo, that issue of understanding things more simply, complex technological devices, in a way being simplified. Is this a major part of his legacy, do you believe?
Well, his legacy is that he really changed the world. I mean, if you think about it, if you think of how much the world, because it starts with his being able to develop the personal computer, the Apple II and then the Macintosh. I mean, he was more than a co-founder. He was a director, the CEO of the company, and the personal computer changed the world. If we look at everything, correspondence, who writes letters now by post? I mean, it's overwhelmingly email. Business, just the whole nature of profit centers is now so much geared to the advertising that appears on the internet and has made a fortune, not just for the manufacturers of computers, but also for people who provide content. I mean, like Google. And then finally, there is social networking, which is so the economy has been altered, the social structure, and even social interaction. It's a revolution, and he did it.
Max Kaiser in Paris. Was he part of a revolution, Steve Jobs, do you believe?
Well, I have to wonder what the success of Apple and Steve Jobs would be had they not received a massive government subsidy in the form of oppressive intellectual property law and draconian copyright law. This is something that Steve Jobs supported in both as a technology magnate and as a film producer in Hollywood. The effort to extend copyright, for example, has been one of the worst innovation killers of the past few decades. And Steve Jobs, of course, benefited magnificently from that. So if you take away this huge government subsidy, would the company really be in the position that it is today? I don't think so.
Well, you've got that issue there that you're referring to, digital rights management, the controlling of music, which was pressed very strongly by Apple and is through items like its iTunes store. Duncan Bell in London, here we have almost a clash between an individual preaching cutting-edge technology and liberation and at the same time fighting to prevent a free dissemination of product. Do you see this dichotomy?
Eventually, Apple did remove the DRM from the music that they sold through iTunes. I don't know if that was a result of a lesson learned in terms of wanting copyright to be a little bit freer, or just simply they calculated they could make the same amount of money with DRM-free music. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if it's really... we're talking about somebody who's just passed away, who is a major figure. Obviously, the question of copyright and intellectual property is considerably wider than that. I mean, I don't think I agree that without as the other guest was saying, without the existence of the idea of copyright and the idea of intellectual property, that Apple would have been unsuccessful somehow. But yes, no, I would agree. Obviously, there's a number of dichotomies with Apple, which is that in many ways they're very cult-like, which would suggest a smaller organisation, but then in fact they happen to be the biggest organisation in the world. It's the way that Steve Jobs always managed to manage this kind of, I think he called it, in fact, the reality distortion field, basically being able to put two things that didn't really seem to go together in a way that made sense on a kind of corporate financial level.
Now, a common theme in remembering Steve Jobs and his contribution to the world has been the fact that he altered the relationship between the human being and the device. That post-Apple, there was a different relationship, a greater sense perhaps of ownership on the part of the person using that mechanical device. Abdullah Schleifer in Cairo, How correct do you think this is? Is this an accurate version of what actually happened in that shifting relationship with man and machine?
Well, I think there was a profound shift. I would phrase it differently. I would say, and this is the downside of it. I mean, by the way, when I describe him as an extraordinary, as a revolutionary, that doesn't mean, I mean, a lot of revolutions have been horrible. Look at the French Revolution. I mean, I know it's still extolled in France, but its implications were really horrendous. Outlawing the church, the terror, the guillotine. So the fact that something is revolutionary, the fact that there are all these aspects of it, which how it came about, whatever, that are negative, is true with most revolutions. Now, what he did in this case is, I think the relationship that is altered is ultimately, instead of it being person to person, it becomes person to machine to person. And you could say, well, that was true with the telephone. True, that's sort of part of the beginning of the electronic revolution. And this is the massive extension of it. But to the degree in which people now date through the internet, I mean, you know, they don't, that's become a prevalent mode. That's how significant, and none of this would be possible. Internet, email, social networking, politics now, revolutionary politics. And now I'm using the word in a very political sense. Here in Cairo, we had an uprising in Tahrir Square, which to a large degree was mobilized not through personal cells like in a revolutionary party or a movement, but through the adroit use of Facebook by the April 6th movement, and then towards just before it by the Khalid Said Facebook page, in which tens of thousands of people were mobilized not by the trade union movements or by revolutionary parties, but by the internet. So I think that's where the relationship is altered. Instead of it being person to person, it becomes overwhelmingly personal, person to machine, machine to person, and reverse.
Now, there was also something within Apple, which is a relationship with music. The creation of the iPod changed the way that people listen to and relate to music. Duncan Bell?
Yes, that's fair to say. I mean, it put people's entire music collection into one little device they could carry around with them. It's almost, it hasn't all about the demise of the album, the long-playing record, whatever you want to call it, as we know, but people don't really listen to albums all the way through. They hop around between their favourite tracks from lots of different sources, sort of almost like a DJ constructing a set as they're going along. Also, of course, as was alluded to earlier, the fact that it's all entirely digital, in many ways, ironically, although Apple itself was very committed to rights management and what have you, did obviously cause a massive upsurge in the pirating, the electronic pirating of music, which has changed the face of the music industry in all manner of ways.
Max Kaiser, that particular point about how the face of the music industry was changed by the invention of a simple device.
Well, sure. Apple famously missed the internet. That was something they had to play catch-up with after others pioneered that use of the internet space and were doing interesting technological things. Apple is very committed to the desktop. And so they did a great job at playing catch-up. As far as the relationship to the machine, as was brought up earlier, we can't forget that these machines are built essentially by slave labor in China, while Apple, the company, sits on $80 billion worth of cash. They could hire, obviously, people in America to do those jobs and help Americans get jobs instead of exporting to China and losing that form of job growth in the U.S. So, again, the company has been able to grow, but at what cost? $80 billion in cash is an unconscionable amount of cash for a company to have. As a matter of fact, it does kind of go into a gray area in terms of companies being allowed to have that much cash without paying a dividend. And the stock itself came under scrutiny just a few years ago with a backdating of options scandal that Steve Jobs was implicated in, taking advantage of the 9/11 tragedy to award themselves cheap stock at a cheap price. So again, if it weren't for the loopholes and for the government subsidies and for the slave labor, would the stock be where it is today?
Well, Duncan Bell, would you like to pick up on those particular hard points being made there?
Yeah, they're very hard. Well, they are fair points. I mean, I have to say, I hope your guest doesn't turn up at my funeral, but It's yes. I mean, I do agree that if you do set yourself up in particular as being against the status quo, to then export all your labour to China, where it's very cheap, where famously, I mean, I don't want to get into too much moral relativism here, but I believe Foxconn, as Chinese employers go, Foxconn is the company that makes most of Apple's products, is relatively good. But yeah, they pay very low wages. They have to have their workers on suicide watch because conditions are so poor. Obviously, there's a troubling dichotomy there. The end result was that Apple was extremely successful. Would they have been as successful if they'd been making their products using American labour, which is more expensive? I don't know. We almost might not be having this discussion. I don't know.
Well, the issue of how Apple products were made perhaps doesn't change the fact that it has become a central figure, an icon in popular culture. And here's an example of how the word Apple came to permeate people's sensibility. A delicate aside in the Oscar-winning movie Forrest Gump.
So I never went back to work for Lieutenant Dan. Though he did take care of my Bubba Gump money, he got me invested in some kind of fruit company. And so then I got a call from him saying we don't have to worry about money no more. And I said, that's good. One less thing.
Well, that little scene in a movie of Dulles Schleifer in Cairo, a very clear indication of how much a greater part of popular culture Apple and its products became and are.
Well, clearly, I mean, first on simply a singular corporate basis, it's a great icon that they have. I mean, Apple, and there it is. It's something that you really can get hold of instead of simply the letters IBM, for instance. So in that sense, it was brilliant. But getting back to this other point, you know, about some of the horrendous corporate practices that have been involved, using cheap overseas labor. As I said before, you know, let us think of him as a revolutionary. Well, Lenin was a revolutionary. I mean, he made the Soviet Union. And he and his successors have endless atrocities on their hands, including slave labor, not just cheap Chinese labor, but slave labor. Robespierre was a great revolutionary and introduced the guillotine and guillotined thousands until he ended up that way. I mean, being a revolutionary is a matter of fact. That doesn't mean virtue or being necessarily abiding by rules of fairness in business. And in fact, there's a whole legacy of revolutions that are pretty scary and nasty. So I think the fact that that Jobs and what he did has had this extraordinary historic fact of life, such as other revolutions have had. I'm sort of old enough to be what you'd call a reactionary, but I have to face the reality. The French Revolution was historic. The Russian Revolution was historic. The computer, the revolution that he set in motion, and whether the fact that maybe other companies took the lead as we went on, what matters is it does start with the Apple II and the Mac, and everything else follows from that, whether it's developed by his company or other companies. And this has changed the world, and that's why I think that, aside from the fact that it might be a little untimely since the man has just been buried, you know, I also think that's another aspect of it, which is the aspect of corporate conduct. But from the point of view that interests me as a journalist, as a social critic, is that this is one of the great revolutions of modern history.
Duncan Bell, we heard mention there as well of a personalization of computers. Before Steve Jobs, computers were marked by numbers. He created a personalization of a product which once again appeared to bring them closer to the human being. How important was that in the general development of society as a whole?
Oh, gosh, well, I don't know about the general development of society as a whole. I mean, he made consumer goods much, much better, in my view, than they'd been before. And by better, I mean easier to use, more approachable by people who weren't necessarily technically minded or who didn't have years and years of experience in working in the various fields they were talking about, be it desktop computers initially, later mobile communications, the MP3 player, the music players. I suppose you could say it's affected society in as much as it's facilitated communication to an even greater degree than technology in general has, because if you can more easily communicate because the device you are using is easier to use, then you will use it more. I think in terms of raising people's expectations of what technology can do, it's changed society in that way. I don't know that I'd want to necessarily draw conclusions beyond that, you know, it's sort of caused a bringing about of humanity 2.0 or anything like that. But it's, socially, he made technology something more like rock and roll and something less like your dad and men in white coats or sort of grey suits did. He was a bit like the Elvis Presley or the Beatles of technology. But, I mean, ultimately, what Apple have done for society is only really to do with how people consume things. It's not revolutionary in the sense that, as your other guest was saying, Lenin or Robespierre was revolutionary.
Max Kaiser in Paris, regardless of what one thinks about Apple's corporate practices, the one argument that admirers of Steve Jobs have been putting since his death and before was his ability to deal with adversity. Remember, he got pushed out of Apple. In that period away, he started that remarkably successful animated movie company, which changed the face of animated movies, came back to Apple and reached his best period. This ability of coming back from adversity, how important a mark of the man is that?
No doubt Steve Jobs is a tenacious fellow. But again, with Pixar, you're talking about a copyright monopoly position and controlling the distribution and creation of intellectual property and building a monopoly position based on that. I mean, if we're looking for revolutionaries, we should talk about people like Richard Stallman, who created the free software movement, which is really behind the Cairo movement and the Tunis movement, not Apple Computer and a bunch of copyright protectionist lobbyists. That's really behind the social movement that we see now. These are the true revolutionaries in the software movement, and they don't get enough attention, in my opinion.
Duncan Bell, your view of that? I saw you smiling, and a particular point is made there.
Well, more just again, I mean, I think possibly we need to separate Steve Jobs, the person who's just passed away, from Apple, the corporate behemoth that does things that we may or may not always approve of. I think if you asked, I don't want to seem patronising, but if you asked people on the street, 99 out of 100 of them, 999 out of 1,000 of them would say Steve Jobs was the person that they recognise as improving the technology they use. They wouldn't necessarily know who the people behind the free software movement and what have you are. And I think, yeah, we need to, if you're thinking of Steve Jobs, the person, the fact that you're talking about somebody who came back to Apple when it was basically, if not on the way out, it was certainly struggling, and he took it to being at one point the biggest company in the world, bigger than oil companies, bigger than gold mining companies. It's an extraordinary achievement, and whatever you think of how he achieved that and how Apple got to the position that it got to, you have to say that he's a sort of 1 in a million individual. And I think I'd be surprised if the technology world saw his like again, to be honest.
Well, once again, admirers have pointed out that nobody really does know the name of the executive officer of General Electric, yet many do know that of Steve Jobs. But Abdullah Schleifer, this particular point that Duncan Bell just made there about it is an end of an era, in a way, of a new technology, of a kind of device, of a type of relationship between human beings and the devices they use. Would you see it like that?
Oh, yes, I understand what you mean. Well, you would say that his death, his passing, is registered, but the phenomena itself, the social phenomena of people interacting through a machine rather than directly, or on a personal level. I mean, like the difference between writing. It's the difference between calligraphy as an art form, and you can get the same thing through a computer, but it isn't the same. I mean, in terms of how it affects the individual.
Well, at that point, that brings us to an end of this program, and all of those with an iPad, an iPhone, will remember fondly and with great respect and admiration the passing of Steve Jobs. But thanks to our guests in Cairo, Abdullah Schleifer in London, Duncan Bell, and in Paris, Max Kaiser. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.